Hey, everybody, we have a special guest today, Dr. Stephen Ross Murray, live from Kona, Hawaii. Going to talk all things Ironman today. He's done well, he'll tell you all about it, but he's done the big boy in Hawaii many times. And how do you train for it? What kind of equipment do you want to use? And we're going to get into Steve a little bit today. He might be just my most distinguished guest ever, and probably one of my longest friends. I've known him ever since we went to Middle Tennessee State University back in Tennessee in the mid 1990s is where I first met Steve. But I had to print this off, Steve. I didn't want to mess this up. You're so prestigious of a gentleman. Dr. Stephen Ross Murray is the Director of Health and Wellness Minor, the Director of the Physical Education Program, and the Professor of Teaching in the Division of Biological Sciences within the College of Letters and Science at the University of California, Berkeley. I'll never forget the first time I met you. You were training for a triathlon race, the Music City Marathon, or the Music City Triathlon, out of Nashville, Tennessee, and I was the lifeguard. And you walked in, and you were buff and fit as could be, and you had this pink Speedo on, and you had this flaming orange yellow hair. And I said, there's the prettiest man I've ever seen in my life right there, Dr. Stephen Ross Murray. Hey, so tell us a little bit about yourself, what you're doing right now, and tell us, most importantly, about that beautiful background you got going on.
Well, firstly, thank you for that ridiculous introduction. That's great. And the date when that was June 1992 is when I met you at Middle Tennessee State University in the gymnasium or at the swimming pool of the old alumni gymnasium. I remember that vividly. God, that's 32 years ago almost. Holy cow, it's a long time ago. I remember that. I am currently in Kona, Hawaii. I'm at a friend's house, and there's the beautiful ocean right behind us. And there's a little pool that we kind of hang out in. I've been over here training a little bit and just having a good time. It's a beautiful morning in Kona right now. It's about 65, 70 degrees, sunny, it's a little windy, and it's around 9 o'clock in the morning. It's
And
absolutely gorgeous. So
yeah,
beautiful.
and you spend about a month out of every year in Kona, right? And you've been doing that for
Oh,
years.
sometimes, yeah, anywhere from 2, 3, 4 weeks, depends upon how long the break is between semesters. My wife and I both come over. She's a professor as well at the University of Utah. And during our breaks, we spend our breaks together, summer breaks, winter breaks. But winter breaks, we usually come here. Sometimes we go to Florida, but normally we come over to Kona and I get to train on the course some. So it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, how many times have you done the big boy?
3 times I did Kona, the Ironman World Championship, 3 times here. And it's been pretty cool, pretty interesting. It was the one thing that I'd never done when I used to race at a really high level many years ago when you first met me. And then about 10 years ago, I told my wife, she did not know that I used to do all these crazy triathlons and stuff. And I said, I'm going to do the Ironman. And she's like, what is that? So I explained to her what it was. And I started training. And then sure enough, I was able to qualify 3 times for it. So I was very fortunate. And then I got to do the race.
Yeah, because it's not something that you can just jump into, that you actually have to qualify for this. And, that's a
That's
battle in and of itself. And so when you're thinking about qualifying for Kona, how do you space that? How do you space your qualifying event with the actual event, the World Championships?
Well, just look at it from this perspective. It takes placing usually in the top 2 or 3 in your age group, maybe fourth or fifth if you get lucky at a big race. But usually, got to be in the top 2 or 3 of your age group to get a Kona slot. And the qualifying races generally are another full Ironman, and they will be raced anywhere from the previous, I would say, August, September, all the way till around July or August of the next year, to where you qualify for that World Championship. And I can put it this way: there was a race once I did the Ironman, and I think I finished 31st overall out of like 2,000, 3,000 folks, and I didn't get a slot. That's how difficult it is.
Mm-hmm.
And then 5 weeks later, I did another race and I finished 29th overall. And I got a slot, luckily, very luckily. An individual passed on his slot and I finished like 5th or 6th in my age group. I can't recall. And again, I was 29th overall. And I got the only roll down for that day. Then a couple other times I qualified. I would get 2nd or 3rd or 4th in the age group or whatever it is. But
How much time do you like between your qualifying event and the main event?
oh, you would prefer months and months.
Yeah.
Full recovery. But I have friends who've done them within 5 or 6 weeks, maybe even, or shorter time frames. Depends upon the year. I mean, preferably if you could qualify in the late fall, then go the next October, that would be ideal.
Yeah.
Give you a
And
whole
so
year.
and you get, so since you're spending so much time in Kona, you're getting to swim the course, run the course, bike the course.
That's right.
And so when we think about your training for this, I'll never forget, man, this was, I guess, decades ago. I was like, Steve, man, because I swam for Middle Tennessee State University. We didn't have an official team, but they were trying to build a team. And so they had, official practices and, things like that. And I'll never forget, watching you train. And then as a lifeguard, I got to see all the triathletes train. Your training was different, right? And so these guys were just out there, it seemed to me at the time. And, I've later confirmed that they were just killing themselves. They were just destroying themselves in the run and in the bike and the swim. And it seemed like as much as we could do, as hard as we could do, that was their method of training. And I'll never forget, like one time, I asked you and I was like, Steve, man, I just really want to get fast on the bike. And I was like, what's the secret? Like, what's the big secret that you have to do? And you said two things. And, you said one was consistency, right? Consistency. I will never forget that because everywhere you go, like me as a coach, like when someone asks me, like, I want to get my FTP up, I want to win this event, what do I need to do? You need to be consistent. That's first and foremost. You need to be consistent. You need to train your body to be consistent. You need to be consistent. And then the other thing that you said is like, you didn't call it zone 2 at the time, 30 years ago. I don't think we were really talking about it in terms of zone 2, but you were definitely you were the athlete that you trained according to you, right? You didn't train according to what someone else was doing or trying to beat your buddy or trying to outdo your buddy. You trained according to you, right? And I'll never forget one time I was trying to, all your buddies were out there swimming. I was like, hey, where's Steve today? And they just rolled their eyes. Oh, he's just out there messing around on a golf course, going for a run. Right. And then I think the next week you won the Music City Triathlon. You know what I mean? You destroyed them all. You know what I mean? But you were legendary for how athletic you were. You were legendary for just your physical prowess and how you destroyed everybody. But you were also legendary because everybody just thought that you were sloughing off, that you were just messing around. So tell me about that a little bit.
Well,
what's your philosophy of training?
Well, thank you, Lee. And what's interesting about that is I was always known as a slow trainer. And I always told everyone, I was like, you have to be able to build the metabolic pathways throughout your body. And to do that, what we now call zone 2 training or just aerobic training is key. And I told everyone I would ride with or I would run with, I go out and jog. And this is 30 years ago when an 8-minute mile or a 7-minute mile was very slow for me. And I was like, oh, now that's almost a race pace. But in those days, it was very slow. And I would just jog like that. And they're looking at me and they go, well, how are you able to race as fast as you are based upon this? And I would explain to them the basic physiology behind it. And I don't think anybody believed me. And I essentially practiced what we now refer to as the 80-20 principle. And I have practiced that pretty much my entire life, if not even 90-10 principle. And I would do 80 to 90% of my training at a very slow pace, a very slow rate, where I would just incorporate what we used to call the talk test. And basically, if you go out and run and you can carry on a conversation, that's a good aerobic.
Zone 2. That's
zone 2. And if it's a little difficult to talk, that's okay. But if you can't talk and carry on a normal conversation, then you're going too hard. And that gets you in the gray zone where you don't want to be. And I tell most people, and this was always been my belief, I said, you go way too hard on your easy days and you go way too easy on your hard days. And now philosophically, I take the same approach. I do the 80-20 or 90-10. Basically 80-20 is ideal in my opinion. And from the science that I've read and I look into, 80% of your training should be very easy, nice stuff where you're just building those metabolic pathways throughout the musculature and getting the heart and lungs strong. And then 10%, or I'm sorry, 20% of that should be at race pace or faster than race pace. And basically that other 20%, half of that should be kind of at race pace, and another half of that should be faster than race pace, irrespective of what distance you're trying to do. Just focus on that race pace. And then kind of play it by ear from there. And then I like to ride a lot of hills. I always found hills to be very effective at making me strong. And I would just ride those because you got to get up the hill, and it's going to automatically make you more fit. And I would just incorporate a lot of hills in my riding and a lot of my hills in my running. And then swimming is so technique based. I just try to get decent technique. I never was a great swimmer. I was okay, but not a great swimmer. And then I would just do some really targeted intervals. I always just swim hundreds on like 130 and try to get under where I could swim them on 115 to 120. And if I could do 10 of those and I could hit under 120, I knew I would be somewhat competitive. So that was it.
I remember you in the pool. Probably no one has ever studied you or watched you more than me as your official lifeguard for several years. And I remember you always just had this nice bounce in the water, man. I always thought you were a pretty swimmer. Like you always just had a very unique style and you had this just beautiful little bounce in the water. But, like what you said about the training, the metabolism and the metabolic training, so, for my athletes, I always say, whatever they're training, they're running, they're swimming, they're cycling. I'm always like, this is a metabolic sport. Endurance athletics is a metabolic sport. So when I get a new guy, like they're masters, they're in their 40s and 50s and they want to get fast. They think it's all muscles. They think it's all big quads or something like that. I'm like, no, man, we got to develop efficiencies. We got to develop your ability to oxidize fats and oxidize carbs and become super efficient at it. We need to develop all these efficiencies. In fact, I want to write a book. In fact, I am. Cycling, the efficiency sport, where it's all about developing these efficiencies. And zone 2 work is great because we now know through the science that the mitochondria is best developed at those lower zones. That's really where we can, burn our fires and create that, just the most robust mitochondria that we can. And so that's, everything that you've been doing for the last, 30 years has just, it's panned out, in the research, and people go another way and they try another way and then they come back to this way, right? Or the industry goes one way and the industry always comes back to this way. And, it's about developing that metabolism. But what I also love, like what you said, for training, we're so tech and we're so data intensive these days, which I love. I want the data, but you don't need the data, right? I talk about the talk test with my athletes, right? You're like, what if their power meter blows up? What if their heart rate monitor doesn't work? I mean, it doesn't mean you miss your ride. That means you do the talk test, right? If you're in an event, you're in a rest, you should know what zone you are in, not by what your Garmin says, but how you feel at the time. And that talk test is, that's a brilliant. I went down a big rabbit hole and I found the guy who is kind of the father of the talk test and watched some videos on him. He's pretty cool. He had a whole lab just dedicated to the talk test, right? And how do you know what zones you are in? By what you can do, right? So I've always, I think, pretty much every time I go out and do something, like on the bike or something, I think Steve Murray's always on my shoulder, helping me out, man, giving me, you're going too hard, right? Or something like that. But I just never forget, like, because I saw not only you train, I saw all the other athletes train. And then I got all the locker room talk when you weren't around. Right. So I hear him talking about you, right? Oh, he's not doing nothing. He's not doing nothing. Oh, he's just messing around on a golf course. Then boom, Steve drops the hammer come race day, right? I love it. So I got the whole picture, and it was always fascinating. And then the guys who were just killing themselves out there, they just never had a great day on event day, or they plateaued, right? And you could see it. You could see it in the pool, right? And so
There's a couple of
I've
things.
always loved that about you.
Let me add a couple of things there,
Yeah.
Lee. Absolutely. I mean, I'm a huge proponent. I teach this when I talk in my courses about fitness and stuff. Consistency is important. And then you got to have fun with it. You don't want it to be drudgery. I mean, there are always days when you might not feel like getting out the door. You're a little lazy. And then once you get out there, you start feeling better. And then when you talk about technique and technology, I should say, not technique, but you have all these new technological advancements. They're very helpful. I mean, I started using a power meter several years ago, and I really like a power meter. It's very helpful. But at the same time, one year I was doing Kona, and my power meter, or it rained the night before, and my power meter got wet and it fried it. So your bike is in the transition area, comes this torrential downpour. Elite E Drive had this much water sitting on certain sections of it. I go in the next day, and my power meter, it's Fritz, and it's reading, and I'll put it this way, it had me reading that day 500 watts averaging. So obviously it's wrong. And I'm like,
right.
port replaced it. It's one of those things that happen. But so during the race, I'm now got to go to plan B. Now, plan B for me, or I should say plan A, is always to triangulate. I use three things. I use perceived exertion, I use heart rate, and then I use my power meter. And I always gauge all three when I do detailed workouts, and I always gauge all three on race day. It's important. Now, back 30 years ago, we didn't have power meters, and everything I had was purely perceived exertion. We had a little bit of heart rate monitors were beginning to be used, and I kind of used a little bit of that, but not much. So I always raced on perceived exertion, and perceived exertion is very difficult to do in Ironman, especially in Kona, where it's very windy and it's hot. You're getting dehydrated. The last half of the bike ride is going to be perceived a lot harder than the first half, because normally you have a headwind coming off your right shoulder the last 30 miles. I mean, it's pretty brutal. I mean, if it's a really, really windy day, it can be just absolutely nasty. So the last hour 20, hour 30 of the bike ride, you could be pushing into a 20-mile-an-hour wind. And that's just devastating. I mean, soul crushing is what we say, because you're pushing out, like for me, 220, 230 watts. That's a substantial amount to average for 5 hours. And if you're pushing into that, you might only be going 12 miles an hour. That's all you can generate, because you got the wind so difficult. It's blowing against you. It's just somebody just pushing against your shoulders like this. And you got to do that for the last hour and a half of a 5-hour ride. That's not a lot of fun. And so that's where the perceived exertion gets skewed. That's where power is extremely important, or heart rate. But then the problem with heart rate is it'll drift on you as you dehydrate, and it can drift as you get hot. It can change. However, you need to be able to have all three of those. And I tell everybody, learn to triangulate on the bike, use perceived exertion, heart rate, and power. Those will be very, very helpful.
Right. And you can, I mean, if you're training right and you're training with heart rate and you're used to looking at it, you can pretty much predict the drift.
That's correct.
Even, on brutal hot days, you're going to know what your heart's going to do. It's something that I track with all my athletes, their cardiac drift, and, try to, let them know, like, here's what's happening, and, just prepare them for all these.
But
these
other
things.
things happen too. This is psychological component. If you're not eating, or you get a little bit behind on your eating, or your, glucose levels drops in your blood, you get a little disoriented, you start doing goofy stuff, you start see, who knows, dude? I mean, I've heard all kinds of horror stories. I got friends out there, they're hallucinating. They're like, I already thought I was at this mile marker, and they've got 30 more miles to go. I mean, we always laugh. We talk about when you're coming back on the Queen K Highway there, and we just say people are going off like Roman candles. They're blowing up like crazy. It's just everybody's blowing up because they've gone out too hard. That's where a power meter really helps. But if you're coming back, and let's say it's a super windy day and you normally ride 5 hours, and now you're riding 5.5 just because it's so windy, you can't ride any faster because you're producing the same power, just slower. Well, where people really slip up is they don't have enough food, or they get their drinking schedule off, their nutritional schedule off, or whatever they're trying to do. And then that's really bad, because now you bonk basically. And then, oh no, you got to run a marathon in a really depleted state. That's not going to end well. I mean, that's just a bad thing. Anyway, that's the kind of weird stuff that happens out there.
Yeah. And so then so like when you're building up for this, like how many hours a week are you training? So you're going into Kona. How many hours a week are you training?
20-ish, sometimes more, sometimes less. Usually it's around 10 to 15 on the bike, mostly 10 to 12 is what I try to do. Sometimes if you do a couple extra long rides, which are very beneficial, at the end, you'll creep up to 15 hours, maybe a little more a week. Because sometimes you're always going to want to do a 100-miler, and that's going to take you 4.5, 5 hours at my pace. And if you don't get caught in wind, if you get caught in wind, it could take longer. And then if you do 1 or 2 of those a week, that kind of elevates it a little bit. But I would say 10 on the bike, 5 to 7 on the run, and then 3 in the water. It's kind of a normal week for me.
And then, so for you, so I want to ask this kind of in two ways. So when you're training for a triathlon, for you, which of the three legs do you emphasize more in your training, or do you? And then do you have a big picture, kind of like what everybody should do, right? What should they focus on? How should they break up their time?
That's a great question. Here's what I tell people. First and foremost, always be consistent. Be consistent in all 3 sports as much as you can. However, there are going to be times of the year. Let's say you live in like New England. Well, riding outside of New England in January and February is pretty rough. I mean, that can be rough. Now, with things like Zwift and all the indoor training, which I've started doing a lot more of, it makes that component a lot easier. You can be more consistent on the bike. But in the past, I would run a lot more in the wintertime because it's easy to put clothes on and run and pretty much anything but ice. I lived in Colorado for 19 years, and I would run almost every morning, no matter what. The only time I wouldn't run outside is if it were ice, because you'll fall, and I don't want to fall. I'd run in snow, no problem, anything like that. Heat, whatever. I just got up in the morning. And normally I would run very consistently year round, as long as I was healthy and everything like that. Cycling, I would try to be as consistent as possible. In the past, I couldn't be because, one, I didn't like to ride indoors. And the old trainers we had were just wind modulated. You had these little fans on, they made a lot of noise, and they just weren't ideal. Today, though, this last year, I mean, I've ridden probably 80+% of my training indoors just because it's simple and it's efficient. And I ride with Zwift, and I use a Wahoo kicker. I'm not sponsored by anybody. That's what I buy. And then I ride with my friends, and one of my friends, he's done Kona like 15 times. The other one's done it 4, I think. And they're really elite guys. And we'll be 4 or 5 days a week at a certain time. And then we ride with Zwift on one screen and then Skype on another. We just talk and ride, hey, come on, baby, pick it up, that kind of stuff. And you can watch your little avatar. That's really helped me be very consistent this year. And I would encourage people, if you can do that with your friends, that would be very helpful. Get in a good group of people, but be consistent. I would say there's nothing's better than absolute consistency in all 3 sports. However, like I've been mostly focusing on cycling. I've reintroduced my running again, and then I haven't been swimming much at all here recently, but I'll start ramping that back up. But swimming's so technique focused, and I'm not a superior swimmer, but I know I can swim roughly an hour for an Ironman. If I swim, I'll tell you, this is a perfect example. I did Kona 3 times. And I've done the practice swim a couple of times. And each one of my swims, under totally different training scenarios, I have swum right at an hour. I have swum right at around 61 minutes. And my worst is right at 62 minutes. So basically, I've done it 5 times, that swim. And I've swum 61 minutes plus or minus a minute for all 5. And each time I use a totally different training strategy. So it doesn't really matter to me. You just got to be fit. And it's just technique based. And that's a decent swim time. It's not a great swim time, but it's a decent swim time. I mean, good swim time for somebody my age would be 55 minutes. I could swim 10,000 yards a day, and I would never swim 55 minutes. I mean,
where do you try to get time on a course? So you're already saying that like swimming is, one of your weaker legs. Where are you going to try to get time on the course?
I would focus on cycling and then being able to be bulletproof on the run. A good friend of mine, he won his age group multiple times, and in Kona, he gave me advice a long time ago. He gave me 2 pieces of advice. Number 1, he said, any kind of run is faster than a walk, meaning do not walk if you don't have to walk. Any kind of run is faster than a walk. So make sure you continue to run. And you can walk through the aid station. And I only give myself 3 steps. I get to an aid station, I'll give myself 3 steps to walk, make sure I get food, then I'm back running. I don't allow myself to walk. And but the key is getting the best biking shape possible. And I used to not believe this. I did not. I used to think you could get in great running shape and then be in modest biking shape. But as I've gotten older, I think you want to be in absolute top cycling shape, and then modest to good running shape will be okay. Now, to be the best of the best, and I'm not the best in my age group. There are guys much faster than I am. To be super elite, I'd have to train an extra 10 hours a week and do a lot more intense stuff. But where I try to maintain my my speed relative is get the best bike shape possible, and then be able to run. Well, I say jog. You're not really running. If you run 8-minute miles in my age group, that's a 3:30 roughly. And then if you can run a 3.5-hour Ironman marathon after biking about 4:45 or 5 hours, that's plenty for a 55-year-old guy. I mean, that's
Yeah.
one.
Correct me if I'm wrong. I think one time you said it, you explained your strategy to me. Like the swim is the warm up for the bike, nail the bike, and then the run is what it is.
That's right. That's exactly
Yeah.
right. And
Yeah.
the point is, I think Joe Friel or some other folks out there, I want to give credit where credit's due. They talked about marathons in an Ironman, and usually they don't get ugly like marathons where people just blow up, at mile 22, they hit the wall. So basically, Ironman marathons either start ugly and get really ugly, or they just stay kind of ugly. Nobody looks great unless you're a super elite, professional like Miranda Carfrey. I mean, she was fabulous in the run. She could run 250 or something, as a pro. And a lot of pros are going to run great times. But as age groupers, if you can just run your normal morning pace for 3.5 hours, you run 3.5 hours at 55 years old. That's an outstanding time, and that's
Yeah.
just going to be great. So it's not really racing. When I was 30 years old, I mean, like my best half marathon, just an open one, I ran like 108.50. It's like 5:15 pace, 5:18. I don't know, somewhere in that range. I mean, I can't touch anything like that now. I'm 55. I mean, I've lost a minute and a half. I mean, you can't run as.
Yeah.
So it's just completely different. Elite marathoners, they run now the world record's like 4:35 per mile pace, something like that for a marathon. The best guys at the Ironman now run 3:30, or I'm sorry, 2:35-ish, 2:38-ish, something like that. So that's only a little under 6-minute pace or something. So, it's completely different than elite runners. I mean, it's just a totally different animal. So your run can be good. It doesn't have to be great, but your bike needs to be great.
Yeah. Yeah. So, let's talk a little bit about your career. So you are at Berkeley University, and like
University of
this,
California, Berkeley. That's right.
yeah, this is a major department. The person that I'm most associated with in terms of the research at this facility is George Brooks, and all of his work on lactate, and his name is kind of out there all the time because he works with a gentleman by the name of Inigo San Milan, who is the coach of today Pogacar, and Brandon McNulty and a couple of other people, and is the head of performance for UAE. And so whenever whenever Inigo does some kind of deep dive, like, so if he's talking for at least an hour or 2 hours, I've even heard a 3-hour podcast from him before, he's always talking about George Brooks, and he's always talking about his work on, the lactate and rethinking lactate and understanding what lactate truly is. And so you are at a pretty giant program that has a lot of big figures there. So what do you teach there? And tell us about your book, your wellness book.
Oh, well, first, thank you, Lee. And George Brooks is legendary. He's a wonderful exercise physiologist. He's an absolutely brilliant man, and you're absolutely correct. He studied lactate, and he looks at lactate as a fuel source, not just as a byproduct, and I mean, he's phenomenal, just a phenomenal professor, and I work at a phenomenal university, and we're both in the Division of Biological Sciences. I don't have much interaction with George in his lab. I mean, I'm in another part of the division. I oversee the physical education program and oversee the minor in health and wellness. And the courses I teach deal more with just general health and general fitness for the average undergraduate, whereas George is working with PhD students and what have you. So I oversee those. We have a couple hundred courses every year. I say almost, well, it depends on which ones we count, at least 200 plus courses a year that I oversee, and we manage those. Those are anything from basic swimming activity courses to a variety of dance forms. We have ballet, we have contemporary, tap, what have you. And then we have standard sports like taekwondo, basketball, a variety of things like that that we offer for just the general undergraduate and graduate student. And we offer those couple hundred courses to about 5,000 students, and it just keeps growing. Each semester we have like 1,500 students on wait list. So that's what I oversee, that program. Then I oversee the minor in health and wellness. That's a lot of students who are taking their baccalaureate degrees, and they obviously study for a minor. And then many of our students go on to graduate school, or they go into medical school or physical therapy school or what have you. So I work with all of them and help them to get into a graduate school and help them pursue whatever their career pathways are. My role as a professor of teaching, I deal more on the teaching aspects. I don't really run a research laboratory. I do publish papers and write books and things of that nature. Like you said, I wrote a book on wellness, and that's used in some of my courses.
Yeah. And
Anyway.
so what is wellness? So health and wellness. So like, what is wellness and what is your book? And the reason I ask is it's so, I started down, this nutritional, this functional medicine idea of, how can we cure chronic diseases and things like that with just, dietary changes, and thinking about it in terms of dietary changes and exercise and wellness instead of statins or medications or pharmaceutical drugs. And, I started down this path probably at the end, the late 1990s when I really started, studying figures who are outside of the mainstream, who, were rethinking. So what is health and wellness? Like, so that was your degree. I remember you had an EDD from Middle Tennessee State University way back when, in health and wellness. So what is health and wellness?
Yeah, well, I got my master's in wellness and fitness, master of science from Middle Tennessee. Then I got a doctor of arts in physical education. To define my health and wellness, it's really simple. Health is simply the status of where you are, what your body's doing, what have you. Wellness is how you develop it, and it's the balancing all the different dimensions. If you go back to the original definition of wellness, it was basically taking your potential as a person, or you maximizing that potential. And Howard Dunn, he worked for the federal government at the time, like I can't remember the exact name, like the Bureau of Vital Statistics or something to that effect. He was an MD and PhD, and he defined the term wellness. That was in the late 1950s. And he had a three-dimensional model. He used the mind, body, spirit, so to speak, that approach. Today, we look at a six-dimensional model. We look at physical, occupational, social, spiritual, intellectual, emotional, POSSE, POSSIE. That's how we look at that. And it's all these realms, everything in your body, and each one affects the other. Look at it this way. Pretend you have a Rubik's Cube, and each dimension is on one side of the Rubik's Cube. And if you work that Rubik's Cube, it's all matched, then that means you kind of have what we call high-level wellness. However, things happen every day. You're driving to work, you have a flat tire, that Rubik's Cube, you just had a flat. And all of a sudden, you bang your knuckles while you're changing the flat. Now, we just mixed up your cube. Can we get your cube back? Sure, those are really minor stressors. But real things happen in real life that are really bad. You could be in a bad marriage. You could have a bad job. You could get fired from a job. You could lose a job. You could have a horrible car crash where you're healthy or unhealthy. You could have a terrible disease. Anything like that could happen. And that's going to cause your Rubik Cube. You're going to have little sides here to be not matched anymore. They're not worked. So that's what we talk about. Wellness in and of itself is developing that cube and trying to balance those six dimensions. That's the way we look at it. And then health is just simply the status of where you are in each one of those dimensions. And then we study that. Then we look at, that's just the global aspect of it. And then
how much do you think about nutrition and diet?
Part of it. Yeah, that's the physical part. The physical part's what I mostly dedicate to, and I look at for my life professionally. And we look, we'll analyze how much exercise is enough. American College of Sports Medicine makes recommendations. So many minutes, it's such intensity, per week and what have you. That's all out there. It's all well published. What I tell people, we analyze that. We look at being physically active. Again, consistency is the key. I tell people a good pair of walking shoes and some modest calisthenics goes a very, very long way to keep somebody just healthy. That's a lot of throw back to caveman days, you run around chasing food, whatever it is. But you got to be moving. And today we have people sit way too much. They don't move enough, and then they gain a lot of extra weight, and that's really bad for the body. And so that's the physicality part. And then I focused on that. But I have other colleagues there at Berkeley. We have some of the world's best psychologists. So we study human happiness, or they look at the positive effects of emotion. And you cannot underestimate the psychological aspects of that. Then we also have people are looking at occupational things. And do you derive pleasure and joy from your work? Or does your job provide you with the financial wherewithal to live your desired lifestyle? Those types of things are important. Societal things, do you get along with people? Are you a hermit, or do you want to be very gregarious? And then that can affect your health. Intellectual capacity and intellectual things you like to do. How does that affect your health? Are you keeping up to date with things? Are you challenging your mind? Those types of things. I don't study this personally, but we have people who study dementia. They study a variety of things, how you can keep an active mind and how that works. All those are part of it. We look at emotions, how emotions affects your health and wellness. One of my good colleagues and co-contributors there at Berkeley, he studies emotions and he studies human happiness. It's a big deal. And we developed our minor in health and wellness. And one of the major courses they take is in human happiness. And we look at the brain, and we look at neurological functioning, and how, like, he just wrote a book on awe, and how does awe affect a person's ability. So we look at it, as a full, all different realms of the person and the whole body as a whole. We don't just look at the physicality, even though I study the physicality.
Right,
other people study the psychological aspects or nutritional aspects or what have you.
Yeah. And then you have the book Wellness for Life. If you were to just say, what is the key concept that underlines that whole book of yours?
Purpose. That's a great purpose. Hands down. I tell people you have to have purposeful direction. Howard Dunn talked about that 70 years ago. The purposeful direction in your environment where you're functioning. For instance, right now, when you and I 30 years ago first met, your purpose was you were a lifeguard earning money so you get through your degrees. Okay. I was there working on my master's degree. My purpose was to be fit, to get through my master's program. And then I wanted to get into a doctoral program. Then I wanted to be fit and get through that. And then now my purpose, I try to be the best professor I can be. I try to be helpful. I try to be fit. I try to be a good husband to my wife. I try to be good friends to my friends. I try to be a good person to myself. It's your purpose. Every day you need to wake up. You need to wake up with gratitude, look around you, go, man, this is what I've got. This is what's positive. We know that gratitude helps people. You want to be grateful for the things you have. Don't look at life as like, oh, what I don't have. Look at what you do have. Be appreciative of what you have. And then set goals to attain whatever you want to attain. And that's your purpose. If I could boil it all down, I tell people to be grateful for what you have and to have a specific purpose in your life, whatever that purpose is.
Well, Steve, let's end it there. That was a great conversation. And this is just an introduction to Steve is so many things. And this is barely an introduction to Kona and the career of Steve Murray. He's had a very prestigious career. So, Steve, thanks so much for joining us today. And I look forward to having you back. Appreciate it.
All
bud.
right. All right, man. Thanks, Lee. See ya.